Let me tell you a story about one of the most decisive advantages in World War II. One that most people never really think about when they discuss the war. It's not about strategy, not about tactics on the grand scale, but about something more intimate, more immediate. It's about the weapons in soldiers' hands and the gap between what American boys were shooting and what German soldiers had to work with. This is a story about firepower, engineering, industrial might, and the cold mathematics of war that decided who lived and who died on battlefields across Europe. Picture yourself in the summer of 1944, standing in the bocage of Normandy. You're a German soldier, and you've got a rifle in your hands. It's a Karabiner 98 Kurz, the K98 as most people call it. It's a beautiful piece of machinery. Precision German engineering at its finest. The bolt is smooth, the wood is polished, the action is mechanical perfection, but you're about to go into combat against American soldiers who have something completely different. And that difference is about to change everything about how you fight. You see, when the firing starts, the American soldiers can pull their triggers as fast as they want. Their M1 Garand rifles are semi-automatic. Every time they press that trigger, the rifle cycles itself. The spent cartridge ejects, a new round loads automatically from the 8-round clip, and they fire again. They can shoot 8 times as fast as they can pull the trigger. Meanwhile, you're working that bolt. Pull it back, push it forward. Pull it back, push it forward. With training and discipline, you might manage to fire 12 rounds in a minute. Maybe 15 if you're really good and really fast and really experienced. But the American next to you, he can fire 40 times in a minute. Maybe 50 if he's well trained and the moment allows it. He's putting 3, 4, 5 times as many bullets down range in the same amount of time. But this story doesn't start in 1944. It starts decades earlier, with a man named John Browning, who understood something fundamental about the nature of warfare. Browning was an American gun designer, and he saw the future. He saw that warfare was changing, that the volume of fire mattered, and that individual soldiers needed to be able to throw more lead at the enemy than they ever had before. When World War I ended, John Browning had already designed some of the most important weapons in military history. He designed the M1 Browning machine gun, which became the standard American heavy machine gun for decades. He designed the Browning automatic rifle, or the bar as everyone called it. And perhaps most importantly, he designed several prototype machine guns that would eventually evolve into the M2 Browning, that famous 50 caliber machine gun that's still in use today, more than a century later. Browning understood mechanics. He understood how recoil works. He understood how to make a machine gun that could sustain fire for minutes without stopping, that could throw hundreds, thousands of rounds at targets. And his genius in design meant that everything he touched seemed to work better, faster, and more reliably than what anyone else was making. Now, here's where the story gets interesting. While Americans were thinking about semi-automatic rifles and higher rates of fire, the Germans were thinking something different. Germany came out of World War I humiliated. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped them of their military, their pride, their sense of national destiny. And when Hitler came to power in the 1930s, he started rebuilding the German military from scratch. The Germans looked at World War I and they drew certain conclusions. They said, we need efficiency. We need reliability. We need weapons that work in mud, in cold and rain, in every condition imaginable. And they built the Karabiner 98 Kurz. It was based on the Mauser action, an action that had been refined through literally decades of use and testing. It was simple. It was rugged. It was utterly dependable. But there's a philosophical difference here between the American approach and the German approach. The Americans were saying, give every soldier semi-automatic firepower. Give them the ability to produce volume. We'll figure out how to make it work. The Germans were saying, keep it simple. Keep it reliable. One rifle, one operator, fast bolt action. Use machine guns for volume fire. It's actually not a crazy philosophy. The Germans understood that machine guns, not rifles, were the real source of firepower in modern warfare. And they were right about that. A well-placed machine gun could stop an entire company of infantry. But here's the problem with that philosophy. If something goes wrong, if your machine gun jams, if it gets suppressed, there's a moment where you need immediate, overwhelming firepower from individual soldiers. Then you're in trouble. And that's exactly what the Americans had learned from their analysis of warfare. Let me explain the M1 Garand. In 1936, the United States Army adopted it as their standard rifle. It was designed by John Garand, a brilliant engineer working for the Springfield Armory. The M1 was gas-operated. When you fired it, the hot gases that came out behind the bullet as it traveled down the barrel were tapped off and redirected into a gas tube. These gases pushed against a piston, which cycled the entire action, extracting the spent cartridge, loading a new one, and returning to battery. It was elegant. It was reliable, and it was revolutionary. The rifle held 8 rounds in a clip. This clip was a single piece of metal that loaded into the top of the rifle. You could grab it and slap it in at any angle. The rifle would chamber a round automatically. When you fired the last round, the clip would eject automatically from the top of the rifle with a distinctive ping sound. A sound that became so famous that soldiers from the era talked about it for the rest of their lives. 7 seconds. That's about how long it took to reload an M1 Garand. 7 seconds of fumbling, of finding a new clip, of getting it in and running. During those 7 seconds, you were vulnerable. But between those reloads, you had firepower like nothing the world had ever seen from a rifle, in the hands of a single soldier. General George S. Patton, one of the most aggressive American commanders of World War II, called the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised. And he meant it. When Patton said that, he wasn't exaggerating. He was making a cold military calculation. The M1 Garand gave American soldiers a decisive edge in individual firepower. In tests conducted by the U.S. Army, when soldiers armed with M1 Garands faced off against soldiers armed with bolt-action rifles in simulated combat, the results were overwhelming. In one test, soldiers with M1s firing at moving targets from 300 yards managed to score nearly 200 hits. Meanwhile, soldiers with bolt-action rifles managed fewer than 100 hits. The M1 was twice as effective, just in terms of hitting power. But let me paint a picture of what this actually meant in combat. Imagine a firefight in a bombed-out town in Germany. American soldiers take cover behind rubble. German soldiers take cover in a building across the street. The moment starts and the Americans open fire. Their M1s are crackling, round after round, so fast that to anyone listening it sounds almost like machine gun fire. The noise is incredible. The volume of fire is terrifying. The Americans fire and move. They fire and move again. And from the German side, the response is slower. The German soldiers are working their bolts. Fire bolt, fire bolt. It's a deliberate, methodical process, but it's slow. By the time the German soldier has fired 3 rounds, the American across the street has fired 12. The American soldiers are winning the firefight almost before it starts, simply because they can put more lead downrange. And here's the crucial part. This wasn't just about rifles. This was part of a much larger American strategy about firepower in general. The Americans believed in overwhelming force. When they attacked a position, they didn't attack with just enough force to maybe win. They attacked with so much force that winning was almost inevitable. And that philosophy extended to everything, from aircraft to tanks to artillery to small arms. Now the title of this story mentions 3,000 rounds per minute. I need to explain where that number comes from. That's not the M1 Garand. That's not even the main infantry rifle. That's talking about aircraft-mounted machine guns. During World War II, American fighter planes were equipped with 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns. In the aircraft version, these guns could fire at rates approaching 1,200 to 1,500 rounds per minute. But more importantly, American bombers were equipped with defensive turrets, rotating turrets with multiple 50 caliber machine guns mounted in pairs. These twin 50 caliber guns could fire at rates of up to 3,000 rounds per minute when you combined their cyclic rates. That's the number, and it represented the cutting edge of American firepower technology during World War II. Let me tell you about the German side of this equation. Germany wasn't sitting still. The Germans understood that semi-automatic rifles were the future. In fact, the Gewehr 43, a German semi-automatic rifle, existed during the war. But here's the thing. It never achieved the production numbers that would have made it the standard rifle. Germany couldn't retool their manufacturing base fast enough. The Kar-98 was entrenched in production. Millions had already been made. And the logistics of war, the ammunition supply chains, the training systems, the whole infrastructure, was built around the bolt-action rifle. Switching everything over to a semi-automatic rifle, even a good one, would have been logistically catastrophic. But Germany did try something even more radical. In 1943 and 1944, they developed the Sturmgewehr, the assault rifle, or as it's more commonly known now, the StG-44. This was a weapon that tried to split the difference between a rifle and a machine gun. It fired a reduced power cartridge called the 7.92 Kurz. It was semi-automatic, or you could switch it to fully automatic. It had a much higher rate of fire than the M1 Garand, and on paper it was a revolutionary weapon. It was, in fact, the first true assault rifle ever adopted by any military in the world. But here's where we get to the real story, the story behind the story. The StG-44 came too late. Production began in earnest in 1944, and by the end of the war, Germany had manufactured somewhere around 426,000 of them. That's a substantial number, but the German army fielded millions of soldiers. The Kar-98 remained the standard rifle all the way to the end of the war. And why? Because you can't change the entire military's equipment when you're losing a war. You can't retrain soldiers in the middle of a campaign. You can't restock ammunition supplies on the fly. The practical realities of war don't allow for it. Germany was stuck with the bolt-action rifle because they had committed to it years earlier and couldn't pivot fast enough. Now, this is where the American industrial advantage really comes into play. The United States, by the end of World War II, had manufactured over 6 million M1 Garand rifles. 6 million, and that number is just M1 Garands. That doesn't include the tens of thousands of submachine guns, the hundreds of thousands of rifles and carbines, the millions of machine guns. The American system of production was a well-oiled machine. They didn't just make weapons. They made them at a scale and speed that seemed almost supernatural to the rest of the world. By 1944, American factories were producing half of all military equipment being produced by any nation at war. Half. And they were outproducing their own needs. America was arming not just its own forces, but those of its allies as well. Compare this to Germany. The German economy was strained from the very beginning of the war. Germany had raw material shortages. Germany had labor shortages. Germany's industrial capacity, while impressive, was constantly being challenged by bombing campaigns, by resource limitations, by the fact that they were fighting a war on multiple continents against enemies that vastly outproduced them. Germany produced about 430,000 Kar-98 rifles per year during the war. About 3% of the total Kar-98s produced over the entire production run. But when you do the math, Germany was producing weapons at something like half the rate that America was. But the firepower advantage goes even deeper than just numbers. Let me talk about ammunition. The American M1 Garand fired the .30-06 cartridge, the same cartridge that had been in use in America since 1906. This meant that the same ammunition could be used in rifles, in machine guns, and aircraft weapons. The supply chain was simple and efficient. You make .3006 ammunition, and it goes to feed rifles, machine guns, whatever needs it. The Germans used the 7.92 Mauser cartridge in their rifles and machine guns. But then when they introduced the STG-44, they introduced a new cartridge, the 7.92 Kurds. Now you have 3 different ammunition types that need to be produced, supplied, and distributed. It's complicated. It's inefficient. It's the kind of logistical nightmare you can't solve when you're losing a war. And let me tell you about the actual mechanics of this advantage. When American soldiers charged a position, they had the ability to put down suppressive fire that was almost impossible for a German defensive position to counter. American soldiers would advance, find cover, and rake the German position with semi-automatic fire. 8 rounds fast. The riflemen would reload in 7 seconds or so. But during those 7 seconds, machine gunners would cover him. Then he'd be back in action. The German defenders were facing a wall of fire. Their machine gun would respond, but it needed to be positioned carefully. It couldn't just react, it had to anticipate where the Americans were going. And while the German machine gun was setting up, more Americans were moving. More Americans were getting into better positions. More Americans were getting closer. By the time the German machine gun was ready to fire, the Americans had already gained ground. The practical result of this was that American casualties from small arms fire, while still significant, were measurably lower than German casualties when the two were in direct combat. American units could suppress enemy positions more effectively. American soldiers could survive firefights at odds that would have been catastrophic for German soldiers. The firepower advantage translated directly into a casualty advantage. But here's something really important to understand, and this gets us into the realm of doctrine and strategy. The Germans understood their disadvantage. They weren't blind, and their response was to emphasize machine gun firepower above all else. The Germans developed incredible machine guns. The MG-34 was one of the finest general-purpose machine guns ever made. And then they developed the MG-42, which was even better. The MG-42 had a cyclic rate of fire of 1,200 to 1,500 rounds per minute. That's right up there with some of the aircraft guns the Americans were using. The German strategy was to make the machine gun the center of their squad's firepower. A German squad would have multiple machine guns, sometimes as many as 4 or 6 by late in the war. These machine guns would be the primary weapon. The riflemen were secondary. The idea was that the machine gun would suppress the enemy, and while the enemy was suppressed, the riflemen and other support troops would maneuver. In a way, it was a sensible strategy. You put your primary firepower where it matters most, and you use the rifle as a supporting weapon. But this strategy had a critical flaw when facing an enemy that had semi-automatic rifles. The American riflemen, armed with M1 Garands, didn't need to suppress the German machine guns in the same way that German riflemen would have needed to suppress American machine guns. American riflemen could return fire effectively and immediately. They could advance under their own firepower. They didn't need to wait for machine gun support to make progress. This meant that American squad tactics, which emphasized individual soldier capability, were highly effective against German tactics, which emphasized central machine gun firepower. In tests conducted after the war, military analysts compared the effectiveness of the two systems. They found that while a well-coordinated German squad with a good machine gun could certainly dominate a firefight if everything went right, an American squad armed with M1 Garands could generate firepower faster and more flexibly. The American system was more resilient. If a German squad lost its machine gun, it suddenly became far less capable. If an American squad's machine gun was destroyed or suppressed, the soldiers could still fight effectively with their rifles. They were less dependent on any single weapon. Now let me tell you about training. The Americans invested heavily in training soldiers to use semi-automatic weapons effectively. American soldiers in the European theater would fire their weapons regularly. They would practice fast loading and reloading. They would practice the mechanics of the rifle until it was second nature. The emphasis was on rapid, accurate fire. American rifle training emphasized putting rounds downrange quickly, without sacrificing accuracy. The idea was that volume mattered, but accurate volume mattered more. A semi-automatic rifle that missed was no better than a bolt-action rifle that missed. German training emphasized different things. With a bolt-action rifle, marksmanship was paramount. You couldn't afford to waste ammunition. You had to make every shot count. German soldiers were trained to aim carefully, to maintain their positions, to work their bolts smoothly and efficiently. It was good training, but it was training for a different kind of weapon. The problem was that when German soldiers faced American soldiers with semi-automatic rifles, all of that careful marksmanship training didn't matter much if the American soldier was already firing back before the German soldier had even worked the bolt on his second shot. Let me paint another picture. It's a cold day in the Ardennes in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. American soldiers are dug in along a road, and German soldiers are attacking. The American soldiers hear the Germans coming through the snow, and they open fire. It's not organized volleys like the European wars of the previous centuries. It's a storm of fire. The Americans are shooting as fast as they can pull their triggers. The noise is incredible. The snow is being kicked up by bullets hitting all around. The German soldiers advance, trying to reach the American positions, trying to get close enough that the Americans' individual firepower advantage doesn't matter as much. But the firepower from those M1 Garands is so intense that the German soldiers can't advance. The attack fails. American ammunition supply is liberal, and they have plenty of it. German ammunition is carefully rationed. And in a firefight where sheer volume matters, rationing is a recipe for disaster. This brings us to another critical aspect of the American advantage: ammunition production. I mentioned earlier that America was producing half of all military equipment being produced in the world during World War II. But for small arms ammunition specifically, the numbers are staggering. American factories produced roughly 47 billion rounds of small arms ammunition during the entire war. 47 billion. That's enough ammunition to give every American soldier who fought in the war thousands and thousands of rounds. Germany, by contrast, was struggling with ammunition production. The German economy was under constant strain. The Soviet Union was capturing German territory, disrupting manufacturing and mining operations. The Allied bombing campaign was targeting German industries directly. German factories were being destroyed faster than they could be rebuilt. And all the while, Germany was trying to sustain production of rifles, machine guns, artillery, tanks, aircraft, all of the equipment needed to fight a multi-front war. Ammunition production, as a result, was always constrained. This meant that American soldiers could be generous with their ammunition. If they had to lay down suppressive fire for a few minutes to allow a squad to maneuver, they could do it. They had the ammunition to spare. German soldiers, by contrast, had to be much more careful. A German soldier in a firefight would think about ammunition conservation. He wouldn't just fire wildly. He would think about whether each shot he fired was necessary. But when you're in a defensive position being attacked by an enemy that has semi-automatic rifles and plenty of ammunition, the ability to be stingy with ammunition is actually a liability. You need to put fire downrange to suppress the enemy. If you're worried about conservation, you're already in trouble. And this brings us back to the question of why Germany didn't switch to semi-automatic rifles. Part of the reason was logistics. Part of it was production constraints. But part of it was also that the German doctrine, the German strategy, was built around the assumption that they would have machine guns to provide primary firepower and riflemen to support them. If every soldier had a semi-automatic rifle, ammunition consumption would have been even higher, and Germany couldn't sustain that level of ammunition production. So in a way, Germany was trapped by their own strategic assumptions. They had built their military doctrine around weapons and supply systems that made sense for Germany's resources and manufacturing capability. When faced with an enemy that had resources and manufacturing capability far exceeding their own, that doctrine became a liability. Let me tell you about the German attempts to modernize their small arms. They weren't asleep. They weren't blind to the advantages of semi-automatic fire. The Gewehr 43 was a semi-automatic rifle that appeared in 1943. It was designed by Walther, one of Germany's premier weapons manufacturers. It was chambered for the standard 7.92 Mauser cartridge, so ammunition was compatible with existing supplies. It was semi-automatic. It could be fired as fast as the shooter could pull the trigger. It wasn't a bad weapon, but it had problems. It had more moving parts than the Kar-98. It was more complex to maintain. It was slower to manufacture. The German factories that were already churning out millions of Kar-98 rifles couldn't easily transition to making Gewehr 43s. Production of the Gewehr 43 never reached more than a trickle. Some units received them, but they never replaced the Kar-98 as the standard rifle. The American M1 Garand had over 4 years of production, ramped up before America entered the war. By the time America did enter the war, the factories were producing them at a rate that would make any general in history jealous. Germany tried to catch up too late, and then there was the STG-44, the Sturmgewehr. This was in some ways the most interesting of the lot. The STG-44 was innovative. It tried to do something that nobody had done before. It tried to combine the accuracy and power of a rifle with the firepower of a submachine gun. It used an intermediate cartridge, the 7.92 Kurz, that was less powerful than the standard 7.92 rifle cartridge, but more powerful than pistol cartridges used in submachine guns. This intermediate cartridge allowed for higher rates of fire, while still maintaining enough power to be effective at longer ranges. The STG-44 was select fire, meaning you could switch it between semi-automatic and full automatic. In the hands of a trained soldier, it was a devastating weapon. But it came too late. Hitler was skeptical of new weapons. He worried about disrupting production, about supply chain chaos, about changing tactics in the middle of a war. When the STG-44 was first proposed, Hitler rejected it. When it was proposed again, he rejected it. It wasn't until German commanders on the Eastern Front literally begged for more of these rifles that Hitler finally approved widespread production. But by that time, it was 1944, less than a year before the war in Europe would end. Factories had to be retooled. Production had to be ramped up. Supplies had to be moved. And even with all of that, only 400,000 or so were made. Millions of Kar-98s would still be in German hands when the war ended. Imagine if Germany had committed to semi-automatic rifles in 1939, before the war even started. Imagine if they had bitten the bullet on ammunition consumption, and just produced them anyway. Would it have changed the outcome of the war? Probably not. But it might have made the war last longer. It might have made every battle harder for the Allies. It might have cost more American, British, and Soviet lives. But Germany made a choice, conscious or unconscious, to go a different direction. And that choice had consequences. Now, let me tell you about the practical soldier's perspective. I've been talking about all of this from a strategic and doctrinal level. But what was it actually like for the guys holding the weapons? An American soldier with an M1 Garand would describe the experience of being in combat as almost overwhelming in its intensity. You're in a defensive position, and the enemy is attacking. Your sergeant yells to open fire, and you put your rifle to your shoulder and start pulling the trigger. The rifle fires and the gas from the barrel cycles the action automatically. You don't think about bolts. You don't think about anything. You just pull the trigger and the rifle does what it's supposed to do. If you're well trained, you're aiming for center mass on the attackers. If you're less well trained, and many American soldiers were just regular guys pulled from civilian life and given a few weeks of training, you're just pointing and shooting as fast as you can. But either way, you're putting lead downrange continuously. Your clip has 8 rounds, and you empty it in maybe 5 or 6 seconds. Then you reach for another clip, slap it in, and you're back in action. The whole process is automatic. Your body has been trained to do it, and your muscles just do it. A German soldier with a Kar 98K would describe something different. You're in a defensive position and the attack comes. Your sergeant yells to open fire and you work your bolt. Pull back, push forward. The rifle fires. The recoil is significant, pushing your shoulder back. You work the bolt again. Pull back, push forward. If you're trained, you're trying to aim each shot. If you're experienced, you're moving your aim to track your target as they advance. But the process is deliberate. It's mechanical. It requires conscious thought. With training and discipline, you can work the bolt and fire maybe 3 or 4 times in the time it takes an American to empty his clip. You're firing fewer rounds, but you're trying to make each one count. In the chaos and noise of combat, that difference becomes absolutely critical. When the enemy is charging, when adrenaline is pumping, when the noise is overwhelming, the American soldier just needs to pull the trigger. Over and over, the rifle does the rest. The German soldier needs to remember to work the bolt. He needs to recover from the recoil and work the bolt again. He needs to aim while his adrenaline is surging, and while the American soldier next to him is putting more fire down range than the German has ever heard in his life. If you've never been in combat, it's hard to imagine the psychological impact of that volume of fire. It's not just loud, it's terrifying. It's disorienting. It's enough to make you take cover and stay in cover. It's enough to make advancing extremely difficult. And when one side has that advantage and the other side doesn't, the side with the advantage has a huge psychological boost. They feel like they're winning. The other side feels like they're being overwhelmed. And in warfare, psychology matters as much as mechanics. Let me tell you about defensive operations because this is where the German advantage was supposed to come into play. The German strategy was that they would establish defensive positions, and then when the Americans attacked, the German machine guns and artillery would do the job of stopping the attack. The individual riflemen would be secondary. They would just help suppress the Americans while the machine guns did the real work. In many cases, this strategy worked. German defenses that were properly prepared and well-positioned could certainly stop American attacks. The siege of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge is a good example. American soldiers surrounded by German forces dug in and held their ground for days. They had semi-automatic rifles which gave them a firepower advantage, but they also had machine guns and artillery. It was a combination of weapons used together that allowed them to hold the position. But in other cases, the German defensive advantage was negated by American flexibility and firepower. When Americans attacked a position with overwhelming firepower, the German defenders were often forced to abandon their positions or risk being completely overrun. The German machine guns would be suppressed by American fire, and by the time the German machine guns could respond, the Americans would already be in or past the defensive position. This is actually a really important insight into modern warfare. In World War II, the role of semi-automatic and fully automatic rifles in stopping an attack had not been fully understood. Most military theory still emphasized that defense was inherently stronger than offense, and that defensive positions with machine guns and artillery could stop almost any attack. But the Americans proved that if you had infantry with enough firepower, You could overwhelm even strong defensive positions. You could put so much fire on a position that the defenders couldn't effectively respond. You could suppress their machine guns while your infantry maneuvered into positions where they could assault the position directly. After World War II, every military in the world started thinking about this. They started asking themselves, how do we incorporate higher rates of fire into our defensive doctrines? Most of them moved toward assault rifles, weapons that could produce more fire than a semi-automatic rifle, but were lighter and cheaper than full machine guns. The assault rifle became the standard infantry weapon around the world, and a lot of this was based on lessons learned from World War II and from the American advantage with the M1 Garand. Now, I want to be careful here not to overstate the importance of individual weapons compared to larger strategic and operational factors. World War II was won and lost based on many factors: industrial capacity, strategic decisions, logistics, the performance of armies at the operational and strategic level, the quality of leadership. Individual soldiers and their weapons are just one small part of that picture. Germany didn't lose World War II because their soldiers didn't have semi-automatic rifles. Germany lost World War II because they got into a war they couldn't win, against enemies they vastly underestimated, with a military and economic system that couldn't sustain a long war, but at the tactical level, at the level of squads and companies and regiments fighting each other, in mud and snow and city streets, the American firepower advantage was significant. It mattered. It shaped how battles were fought. It influenced casualty rates. It influenced tactical options available to commanders. And in some cases, it probably saved American lives and cost German lives. Let me talk about combined arms tactics and how the American firepower advantage fit into the larger picture. American military doctrine by 1944 had evolved into something quite sophisticated. It wasn't just about individual firepower. It was about combining that firepower with other elements: machine guns, mortars, artillery, aircraft, armor. But the foundation of American infantry tactics was that your riflemen could generate enough firepower to suppress an enemy position while other elements of your squad or platoon maneuvered. A typical American infantry squad would have a squad leader with a pistol or rifle, 8 riflemen with M1 Garands, 1 M1 carbine, a lighter, smaller rifle issued to support personnel, and a Browning automatic rifle. The bar. The bar was an automatic weapon capable of full auto fire. It gave the squad additional firepower for suppressive purposes. But the baseline firepower of the squad came from those 8 M1 Garands. And when those 8 Garands were all firing, the volume of fire was impressive. The squads were designed to be able to suppress enemy positions, allow 1 or 2 team members to maneuver, and gradually advance or assault a position. A German infantry squad, by contrast, would have a squad leader with a rifle or pistol, 9 riflemen with Kar 98Ks, and 1 or 2 machine guns. The primary firepower came from the machine guns. The riflemen were there to support the machine guns and to provide security. The doctrine emphasized that the machine guns would suppress the enemy, and the riflemen would provide support. When these two types of squads faced each other, what happened depended on the situation. In a purely defensive position, where the German machine guns had good fields of fire and were well positioned, the German squad could certainly dominate. A machine gun with a rate of fire of 800 to 1,000 rounds per minute is an incredibly powerful weapon. It can suppress multiple American squads if they're in the open. But in more fluid situations, in ambushes, in close quarters fighting, in urban terrain where machine guns have limited fields of fire, the American squads with their semi-automatic rifles had a huge advantage. They could react quickly. They could pour fire on an enemy position from multiple directions. They could take advantage of cover and maneuver much more effectively than German squads that depended on coordinating fire with centralized machine guns. This is really where the American advantage in semi-automatic rifles showed itself. It wasn't that the M1 Garand was some superweapon that made the Kar-98 obsolete. It was that the M1 Garand, combined with American doctrine and training, allowed American soldiers to operate more flexibly and to generate firepower more quickly in a wider variety of situations. Let me tell you about ammunition characteristics and ergonomics, because these things mattered more than people often realize. The M1 Garand fired the 30.06 cartridge. This was a full-power rifle cartridge, meaning it had a significant amount of powder and delivered substantial power downrange. Did typical infantry combat ranges, 100 to 300 yards. The 30.06 was more than adequate. It would kill a man, and it would do it reliably. The Kar-98 fired the 7.92 Mauser, which was similarly powered. The two cartridges were roughly comparable in terms of power. Where they differed was in logistics and production. But there's something else that mattered: the loading mechanism. The M1 Garand used an N-block clip. This was a single piece of metal that held 8 rounds. You held it in your hand or kept it in your ammunition pouch, and when you needed to reload, you slapped it into the top of the rifle. This took maybe 2 or 3 seconds. The clip would spring up and seat itself. The rifle would chamber the first round automatically if you had used the charging handle to cock it. Or if you were already holding the rifle at the ready, you could just load the clip, and the first round would chamber the next time you pulled the trigger. The Kar-98, by contrast, used a 5-round internal magazine that was loaded with stripper clips. A stripper clip was a framework of metal that held 5 rounds. You would open the bolt, push the stripper clip down into the magazine, and the rounds would be forced into the magazine. Then you'd remove the stripper clip and close the bolt. It was relatively fast, maybe 5 or 6 seconds, but it required more coordinated movements. And it required the striker to be cocked before you could fire the first round. In the heat of combat, the difference between 2 seconds and 6 seconds for reloading is enormous. Over the course of an hour-long firefight, the American rifleman is spending less total time reloading. He's spending more time actually firing. He's keeping more pressure on the enemy. He's making it harder for the enemy to maneuver or counterattack. Now let me tell you something interesting about the M1 Garand. Many people assume that because it was semi-automatic, it had a higher rate of fire than the Kar-98. In terms of cyclic rate, how fast the mechanism itself cycles, yes, it did. The M1 would cycle maybe 50 or 60 times per minute if you just held the trigger down, while the Kar-98 had to be worked by the soldier. But in actual combat, with a trained rifleman who was taking aimed shots, the rate of fire wasn't dramatically different. A well-trained German soldier with a Kar-98 could fire 12 to 15 rounds per minute. A well-trained American soldier with an M1 could fire 35 to 40 rounds per minute. But where it really showed was when the shooting got fast and furious. When both sides were in a rapid firefight, the American soldier with his semi-automatic rifle could absolutely pour on more fire than the German soldier with his bolt-action rifle. A German soldier in a panic might work the bolt fast and get off 15 or 20 rounds in a minute. An American soldier in the same panic could fire all 8 rounds from his clip in maybe 10 or 15 seconds. That's a difference of 8 rounds against 20. And then the American soldier reloads and goes back to firing, while the German soldier is still trying to find his next target. The psychological difference is also important. An American soldier knew that if he needed to put more fire downrange, he could just pull the trigger more times. He didn't need to think about the mechanical process of reloading. His training had made it automatic. A German soldier had to think about the process. He had to consciously work the bolt. In high-stress situations, conscious thought is a liability. You want your body to just do what it's been trained to do. Let me paint one more picture to drive home this point. It's late 1944. in the forests of eastern France or the woods of Belgium. Two squads, one American and one German, stumble into each other at close range. Neither expects it. Both are suddenly in a firefight for their lives. The American squad leader yells, "Contact right!" and the American soldiers immediately begin firing. They're behind whatever cover they can find. Trees, rocks, terrain features. They're pulling their triggers as fast as they can aim. 8 rifles, each potentially firing 4 to 5 times in the first few seconds. That's 30 to 40 rounds downrange in under 5 seconds. The German squad, meanwhile, is also taking cover and starting to return fire. But they have to work their bolts. Pull back, push forward, fire, pull back, push forward. Fire again. It's coordinated, it's disciplined, but it's slower. In the first 5 seconds, they might put out 15 to 20 rounds. The American squad has essentially doubled the German squad's output. For a few seconds, the firefight is a shock to the German system. They're getting more fire than they expected. People are going down. There's confusion. The American squad, on the other hand, is in control. They're generating fire faster than the Germans can respond. They're advancing. One team moving while the other suppresses. The Garand armed Americans are overwhelming the Kar-98 armed Germans through sheer volume of fire. Of course, this isn't a universal outcome. If the Germans had better positions, or if they had a machine gun supporting them, or if the situation favored the defender, the outcome could be different. But in this kind of meeting engagement, where both sides are surprised and have to react, the American firepower advantage is decisive. Now, let's talk about the bigger picture. Why did America build an army around semi-automatic rifles while Germany built an army around bolt-action rifles and machine guns? And what does it tell us about how the two nations saw warfare? America entered World War II late, in December 1941. By that time, the M1 Garand had already been in production for several years and had been designed and tested extensively. General Douglas MacArthur had given his famous endorsement, and the Army was committed to this weapon. American military doctrine, as it was developing in the late 1930s and early 1940s, emphasized individual soldier capability. America wanted every soldier to be able to generate firepower. America believed in training soldiers to a high standard and trusting them to act independently. This philosophy meant that semi-automatic rifles made sense, every soldier becoming a walking gun that could produce fire quickly and effectively. Germany, by contrast, was thinking about efficiency and standardization. Germany came out of World War I with all sorts of different weapons used by different units. They wanted to standardize everything. They wanted reliable, proven designs that could be produced at scale. The Kar-98 was proven. It had been used since the late 1800s. It was reliable. Worked in any weather, any condition. Millions could be produced by established factories using established techniques. There was no risk. There was no need to develop something new. But Germany also had limited resources. The German economy was already stretched even before the war started. Hitler had been spending heavily on rearmament. Building semi-automatic rifles that consumed ammunition faster would have been a burden on an already strained economy. Using bolt-action rifles that consumed ammunition more slowly made sense from a resource conservation perspective. And Germany's military doctrine, which emphasized machine gun firepower and well-coordinated tactics, made the bolt-action rifle an acceptable choice for riflemen. In some ways, both approaches were rational, given each nation's constraints and assumptions. America, with vast natural resources, could afford to be generous with ammunition. Germany, with constrained resources, had to conserve. America, with faith in its training and its soldiers, could give every man a semi-automatic rifle. Germany, without the same level of universal training, might have had a harder time maintaining discipline with soldiers having fully automatic weapons. But in practice, in the real world of warfare, the American approach proved to be the better one. The semi-automatic rifle, combined with American firepower doctrine, gave American soldiers a decisive advantage over German soldiers armed with bolt-action rifles. The Germans tried to compensate with machine guns, but they couldn't fully overcome the disadvantage. The German attempts to modernize, the Gewehr 43, the STG 44, showed that they understood the problem. If they had been able to equip their entire army with semi-automatic or selective fire rifles, they would have. But by the time they decided to do it, they didn't have the time or the resources to do it. The Kar-98 remained the rifle Germany would fight the war with. Now, let me talk about the technology underlying these weapons, because that's also important to understanding why America had the advantage. The M1 Garand's gas-operated system was cutting-edge technology for the time. John Garand had pioneered this system, and the M1 was the first semi-automatic rifle to use gas operation on a large scale. The system was elegant. It was reliable. It had been thoroughly tested. By the time America entered the war, the design had been refined and improved. Most of the problems had been worked out. When American soldiers carried the M1 into combat in 1942, it was a mature, reliable weapon. The Kar-98's bolt-action system was ancient, literally. The bolt-action principle had been in use for over 100 years by the time World War II started. It was proven. It was reliable, but it had one fundamental limitation. You had to manually cycle the action to fire each round. Germany did experiment with gas-operated rifles. In fact, the Gewehr 43 used a gas-operated system similar to the M1's. But by the time Germany decided to adopt it, the production lines for Kar-98s were already set up and running. Retooling to make Gewehr 43s would have disrupted production, so Germany stuck with the Kar-98. One more thing about the Kar-98 that's worth noting. It had one advantage over the M1 in terms of design. The K-98 had a 5-round magazine, while the M1 had an 8-round clip. This meant the K-98 used less ammunition per reload. The Kar-98 was designed for efficiency. Every soldier carried the same amount of ammunition as an M1 soldier, but needed fewer shots to keep a Kar-98 loaded. This was a rational choice for an army that was concerned about ammunition supply. But in practice, in the chaos of combat, this advantage was overwhelmed by the semi-automatic advantage of the... Let me tell you about one more aspect of this, the training and doctrine differences. American soldiers went through basic training that typically lasted 8 to 12 weeks. During this time, they would fire their rifles extensively. They would practice at known distance targets. They would practice rapid fire. They would practice reloading. They would practice magazine changes. The emphasis was on getting comfortable with the rifle, understanding how to shoot it accurately, and understanding how to reload it quickly. By the time an American soldier went into combat, he had fired his M1 perhaps 1,000 times. More importantly, he had practiced the mechanics of the rifle until they were automatic. His fingers knew where the magazine was. His body knew how to slap it in. His eyes knew how to look at the sights. The process was automatic. German training was similar in some respects, but different in others. German soldiers also went through basic training where they learned to shoot. But the emphasis in German training was often on marksmanship and accuracy, firing slowly and carefully, making every shot count. This made sense given their weapon. But it also meant that German soldiers were sometimes less comfortable with rapid fire. When combat came and situations demanded fast shooting, some German soldiers found the shift in mental approach difficult. Of course, elite German units like the SS or the Wehrmacht regulars with combat experience were very good at fast shooting. But the average German soldier coming into the army in 1943 or 1944, late in the war, might not have had the same emphasis on rapid fire that American soldiers had. This is speculation based on doctrine and training philosophy. but I think it's likely that it contributed to the American advantage. American soldiers were trained to put out volume. German soldiers were trained to make their shots count. When you're facing an enemy that's putting out more volume, training to make every shot count is less valuable than you'd hope. All right. Let me tell you about one specific historical engagement that illustrates a lot of these points. In September 1944, the 101st Airborne Division, an American airborne unit, parachuted into the Netherlands as part of Operation Market Garden. They were armed with M1 Garands, carbines, and submachine guns. They were lightly equipped. Airborne troops are always light on equipment because they have to jump out of aircraft. They didn't have heavy machine guns or much artillery support. They were relying on their individual soldiers' firepower. The 101st ran into German parachute troops, the Fallschirmjäger. These were elite German units, well-trained, well-equipped with machine guns and other support weapons. They were armed with Kar-98s and machine guns. The conventional wisdom would have been that the lightly armed American airborne troops would be overrun by the heavier German forces. But what actually happened was that the American soldiers, despite being lighter and having less support, were able to hold their positions and eventually advance. Part of this was American tactical skill and leadership, but a significant part of it was also the firepower advantage of the M1 Garand. The American airborne soldiers could put out more fire with their rifles than the German soldiers could. When the Germans attacked, the Americans could respond with intense rifle fire. The American positions were hard to overrun. There are many battles and engagements like this from World War II. In almost all of them, when American rifle-armed units faced German Kar-98 armed units in direct combat, without other factors significantly favoring one side or the other, the Americans had the advantage. This advantage wasn't always decisive. Good positions, superior numbers, artillery, or machine guns could overcome it, but it existed. Now let me talk about the war in the Pacific because this story is somewhat different. In the Pacific War against Japan, the M1 Garand proved equally effective. American soldiers in the jungles of the Philippines, in the islands of the Pacific, in the mountains of Burma, they all carried M1 Garands and benefited from the semi-automatic advantage. Japanese soldiers, armed with Arisaka rifles, which were bolt-action rifles similar in many ways to the Kar-98, were at a similar disadvantage. The Arisaka had a 5-round magazine and required manual bolt operation. Against American semi-automatic fire, Japanese soldiers in direct combat found themselves at a firepower disadvantage, similar to what German soldiers experienced. The Japanese did produce some semi-automatic rifles, but in even smaller numbers than Germany, and their standard rifle throughout the war remained the Arisaka. So in the Pacific War as well, the American semi-automatic rifle gave American soldiers a significant tactical advantage. By the end of World War II, military theorists and commanders around the world had absorbed the lesson. The semi-automatic rifle wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. Every major military began looking at developing assault rifles, weapons, that could provide more firepower than semi-automatic rifles but be more practical than full machine guns. The Soviets developed the Mosin Nagant, but after the war, they shifted to the SKS and then the AK-47. The British initially stayed with bolt-action rifles after the war, but eventually moved to the EM2, one of the first true assault rifles. The French developed the MAS-49. The Germans, in the form of West Germany after the war, developed the G3, which used a battle rifle design. By the late 1950s and 1960s, almost every military in the world had moved to either assault rifles or selective fire battle rifles, weapons that offered more firepower than the old bolt-action rifles. This transition happened directly because of lessons learned in World War II. The American advantage with the M1 Garand had shown the world that semi-automatic and automatic firepower from individual soldiers was not a luxury, but a necessity. Let me tell you what happened to these weapons after the war. The M1 Garand remained in production for a few more years after 1945. Production ended in 1957, but by that time, the U.S. military was transitioning to the M14, a selective fire battle rifle that fired the same .30-06 cartridge, but offered both semi-automatic and full automatic capability. The M14 served as the standard rifle for U.S. forces through the 1960s. By the time of the Vietnam War, the M1 Garand was being phased out. Some reserve units still had them, but the primary rifle had become the M16, an assault rifle chambered for the much smaller 5.56 NATO round. The M16 could fire both semi and full auto, and it represented another step in the evolution that had started with the M1 Garand. The Kar-98, after the war, was captured in enormous quantities by the Soviet Union. The Soviets refurbished thousands of them and supplied them to communist allies. Kar-98s showed up in the Chinese Civil War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. Some are still in use in remote parts of the world today, more than 80 years after they were manufactured. They're that reliable and that well made. But no modern military uses the Kar-98 anymore. It's a museum piece, a collector's item. The lesson of World War II, that semi-automatic firepower matters, became universal. Every modern soldier in every modern military carries a rifle that can fire multiple rounds with each trigger pull, or in the case of assault rifles has the option to do so. Now, let me bring this back to the title of this story. 3,000 rounds per minute. That's not the M1 Garand. That's not even infantry weapons. That's aircraft-mounted machine guns. During World War II, fighter aircraft bristled with machine guns. An American P-51 Mustang fighter had 650 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing at around 600 to 1,000 rounds per minute. Combined, they could produce 3,000 or more rounds per minute. These aircraft guns were incredibly important in the air war. The high rate of fire meant that a fighter pilot only needed a brief burst to do significant damage to an enemy aircraft. Airframe design, structural failures, engine damage. A few seconds of fire from multiple guns could cripple or destroy an enemy plane. German aircraft had similar firepower. The Bf-109 had machine guns and cannons. They could produce similar rates of fire. But in the overall air war, American aircraft had certain advantages. Better engineering, better pilot training by the end of the war, better overall aircraft performance. The Americans achieved air superiority. But the point is that the Americans were thinking about firepower from every angle. From infantry rifles to machine guns to aircraft weapons, they were trying to generate overwhelming firepower at every level. And that philosophy, that consistent emphasis on generating more firepower, was one of the reasons the Americans won the war. At the infantry level, the semi-automatic rifle was the expression of that philosophy. At the machine gun level, it was weapons like the M2 Browning. At the aircraft level, it was multiple guns producing thousands of rounds per minute. At the artillery level, it was massive production of shells and howitzers. It was an approach to warfare that said, we have the resources, we'll use them. We'll put more firepower downrange than the enemy can. And against an enemy that was trying to be efficient and conservative with their resources, that approach worked. Now, one last thing I want to mention. I've been focusing on the technical and tactical advantages, but there's also a human element to this story. American soldiers carrying M1 Garands knew that they had a good weapon. They knew that when it came down to a firefight, they could put out more fire than the German across from them. That knowledge gave them confidence. It gave them an edge. In warfare, psychology is as important as mechanics. Soldier who believes his weapon is superior will fight harder, will take more risks, will be more aggressive. An American soldier with an M1 knew he had that advantage. A German soldier with a Kar-98, late in the war, knew that American soldiers had semi-automatic rifles. He might have heard stories about their firepower. He might have faced them in combat. That knowledge could breed a certain defeatism. Not always, of course. German soldiers fought with incredible discipline and courage, even in the face of superior enemy firepower. But the knowledge that the enemy had a technical advantage was there, and it affected morale. Morale is one of the most important factors in warfare. It determines whether troops will attack, will hold, will persist in the face of adversity. The American firepower advantage didn't just affect the mechanics of combat. It affected morale. It affected how soldiers thought about their chances. And that psychological factor was as important as the mechanical one. You know, it's interesting to think about what would have happened if Germany had made different decisions. What if Hitler had approved semi-automatic rifle development earlier? What if Germany had bitten the bullet on ammunition production and equipped their infantry with the Gewehr 43 starting in 1943? What if the STG-44 had been produced in the millions instead of the hundreds of thousands? The answer is probably that it still wouldn't have mattered that much. Germany faced an enemy that was producing more weapons, more ammunition, more of everything than Germany could possibly match. The Soviet Union was producing tanks at a faster rate than Germany. America was producing aircraft at a faster rate than Germany. Germany was in a war where they were outproduced at every level. A better rifle would have helped, but it wouldn't have changed the fundamental imbalance. But it's an interesting historical counterfactual, and it shows us that sometimes history isn't determined by the best weapon. It's determined by which side can produce more weapons, can supply them more reliably, and can use them more effectively. That's really the story here. It's not just about the M1 Garand or the Kar-98. It's about industrial capacity. It's about logistics. It's about training and doctrine. It's about the integration of weapon systems. It's about which nation could sustain a global war. The Americans could. That's why they won. The Germans couldn't. That's why they lost. But in the meantime, in all the battles and firefights and moments of combat that happened across Europe and the Pacific, from 1941 to 1945, the American soldiers with their semi-automatic rifles had a real, measurable advantage over German soldiers with their bolt-action rifles. That advantage meant something. It meant that sometimes Americans who could have died lived. Sometimes Germans who could have lived died. It meant that certain positions fell when they might have held. It meant that certain advances succeeded when they might have failed. The 3,000 rounds per minute aircraft guns were impressive, but they were rare. The real firepower advantage that mattered was at ground level, where a trained American soldier with an M1 Garand could fire 40 times a minute, while a German soldier with a Kar-98 struggled to fire 20. That difference, multiplied across thousands of soldiers and thousands of engagements, was what gave America the edge in the actual fighting. It's a reminder that in warfare, the small things matter. The tools matter. The training matters. The doctrine matters. The person holding the gun matters. A nation can have the best strategy in the world, but if the soldiers at the front don't have the right weapons in their hands, that strategy can fail. And conversely, soldiers with superior weapons and training can overcome many other disadvantages. The American soldier with the M1 Garand had an advantage. He knew it. The German soldier with the Kar-98 knew it too. And in the chaos and noise and smoke of combat, that advantage translated into real consequences.